Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here for episode 38 of the show. There aren't any new questions or reviews this week, but I do want to remind you to shoot your questions, games, suggestions, dares, and comments my way via email to klutchkittengaming@gmail.com or via DM on Instagram at klutchkittengaming. Also, a super simple way to support the show, just beyond listening, is to give it a 5-star review on iTunes. All you have to do is search this show on iTunes or Apple Podcasts and click that 5th star. This week's news is very much Tim Sweeney themed. Mr. Epic himself has been quite active on Twitter lately, and Epic is making even more moves in the gaming space. Let's start out with the reasoning he gave for Epic's choice of revenue split with developers. Tim said, "Why 12%? We chose this number to provide a super competitive deal for partners while building an enduring and profitable store business for Epic. From that 12%, we net around 5% after direct costs, and that could grow to 6 to 7% with greater economies of scale." Obviously, it's in his best interest to brag about how their cut is better in comparison to Steam, but it's also cool to get a picture of how much Epic is actually profiting from that 12% take. The second tweet I want to point out is in response to a question about Epic buying so many exclusives for their storefront. Tim says, "If Steam committed to a permanent 88% revenue share for all developers and publishers without major strings attached, Epic would hastily organize a retreat from exclusives while honoring our partner commitments and consider putting our own games on Steam." When I first heard this tweet, my initial thought was, what's the point of saying this? He's phrasing it in such a way that makes it sound like Epic is somehow the ethical pay police and that the only reason they're buying exclusives is to push Steam to give a bigger revenue cut to developers. Sure, Epic's revenue splits might force Steam's hand to change their own, but Epic buying exclusives has nothing to do with them wanting Steam to change. It's strictly a competitive move to get players into their ecosystem. Also, if Mother Epic decides to stop grabbing exclusives once Steam changes revenue splits, it will have nothing to do with rewarding Steam for doing the right thing. It's only because of a strategic, competitive choice. Alright, rant over. The last and most recent piece of Epic news is that on May 1st, they acquired Psyonix, the developer of Rocket League. In my mind, this is actually a pretty big buy, and I'm curious if they're going to start buying up studios kind of like Microsoft has been doing lately. One side note to mention is that Epic has clarified that in the short term, Rocket League will remain on Steam. They haven't yet disclosed their plans for the long term, but I am sure they will become more apparent as time goes on. Let's move on now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Book of Demons, which is an isometric hack-and-slash action RPG. This game was first released in early access in 2016, but it wasn't officially released until December 13th of last year. It's currently on just PC and Mac, however, the Xbox One version is in development. Book of Demons was developed by ThingTrunk. I keep wanting to say Think Tank, it's ThingTrunk. ThingTrunk was founded by 3 guys whose names I'm not going to try and say. My Polish speaking is non-existent, so I'll save you from my poor pronunciation. One of the founders came from Code Minion, and the other 2 came from Twin Bottles. A few games that are notable in their history are Magic Match, Brunhilde, and Phantasmat. What originally struck me as incredibly interesting about these guys is the following snippet I took from their site. They, referring to the 3 founders, quickly became disappointed with the miring trends in the casual games market. They scrapped their former brands and together they founded ThingTrunk to focus solely on the ambitious return to games idea. What is the return to games idea, you might ask? I'm going to read exactly what the website says again since it puts it much better than I could. Return to Games is a series of unique, mid-core games inspired by the golden days of PC gaming. There will be 7 games in total, each unique in terms of genre and theme, but all sharing the same grand vision. Each R2G title is a tribute to a single hit from the 90s, a reimagining of a single universal story for a brand new audience, using modern means and innovative gameplay mechanics. Our goal is to bring back the experiences and universal stories of those hit games and make them accessible to everyone, both casual and hardcore players. We are also simplifying and/or straight out changing the mechanics and compressing the experience of the original games into extremely short gameplay sessions. This way the games can be enjoyed by people who don't have much time, like grown-up fans of classic games or casual players accustomed to playing Angry Birds. I really love this concept. It's a super fun idea and there are a lot of directions they could take it in. Alright, that was the long-form introduction of Think Trunk and their first game in the Return to Games series, Book of Demons. Currently, Book of Demons costs $24.99 on Steam, and according to howlongtobeat.com, it takes anywhere from 10 to 12 hours to beat. However, I believe that estimate is just for a single class to complete the campaign. I don't think the campaign changes at all when you use one of the other 2 classes, but it does provide quite a bit more gameplay if you're the type of person who likes having to run for each class. Both mouse and keyboard and controller are supported, but I would definitely encourage you to use mouse and keyboard. There's a lot of clicking in the game, and having that speed and accuracy makes a big difference. I used my Xbox controller for literally less than a minute and hated it, but who knows? Maybe I'm just not giving it a chance and it could be a decent experience. Let's move on now to discuss the narrative. The cathedral is dark. Don't come near. The air is heavy. What's that you hear? Whispers of dead flow into your ear. The townspeople can't help but shudder in fear. Will you slay the beast with a sharpened spear? The barmaid asks as she brings you your beer. Paperverse will be saved. This is the year. First off, yes, if you're looking for a talented poet, I am taking bookings. It costs, $1,000 an hour, but I will do it if you need, so just putting that out there. Anyways, the entirety of this game takes place in a pop-up book, and you're tasked with saving the day for Paperverse. The archdemon himself threatens to take over the land, and only you are strong enough to fight him. You start out as the warrior, and before each trek into the dungeon, you're able to talk with any of the 4 other people in town: the sage, fortune teller, barmaid, and healer. Although their primary purposes are gameplay related, they can also have conversations with you which reveal different bits of lore for the game. Outside of those small pieces of narrative, there are also a few cutscenes which play as you slowly work your way toward hell. I don't really want to spend too much time on the actual narrative because it really isn't the focus of Book of Demons. There was more lore building than I expected, but the whole point of this game is to kill the big bad and save the world. That story has been done 1,000,001 times, but the one thing I will mention is that I enjoyed the tone of the game. Although the main conceit of the story is pretty dark and evil, you're going to kill the devil himself, the archdemon. Even though that part is dark, the tone isn't. To illustrate my point, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the dungeon map, you'll see the devil taking what appears to be a bath in a tub of flames while playing with a rubber duck and smirking at the screen. The tone of the game isn't straight up comical like South Park's Stick of Truth or something along those lines, but there are plenty of little moments where a funny flair is thrown in, and it really helps to lighten the mood. Now that we know some about the narrative, let's discuss the gameplay. At its core, Book of Demons is a Diablo 1-like. The developers mentioned that they wanted this game to be both a tribute to and parody of the first Diablo, and I think they did a great job of nailing that goal. You start out by having access to the warrior class, but as you level up, you unlock the ability to start new runs with two other classes, the mage and rogue. After choosing your class and having a few brief conversations with the people in town, you can enter the dungeons. The first thing that you're going to be presented with is the flexoscope. It's actually not a weird doctor's tool like you're imagining. This is the way the devs accomplished their goal of making Book of Demons bite-sized. As we mentioned earlier, one goal of the Return to Games project is to provide games which can be consumed in short play sessions. The flexoscope allows just that. All that the system really is the ability to choose how long your dungeon run will be. You can choose from, I believe, 5 levels of length, which each rewards you proportionally more the longer they are. The only real gameplay impact this has is your ability to access the town. The town, which contains some key progression systems, can only be accessed outside of runs, so naturally if you're dungeon crawling longer, you'll have to wait longer to use those systems. This presents a risk-reward choice. You'll get more treasure if you stay longer, but you could be putting yourself at risk. In addition to that gameplay impact, the ability to choose between a short, 5 or 6 minute run and a large 40-minute run, and anything in between, was super handy as someone who can't always have long play sessions. After you choose the length of your run, you enter the dungeon. One of the most interesting things that you'll notice right off the bat is the lane system. Unlike many action RPGs where you can wander wherever you want, Book of Demons constrains your movement to pathways. Although this limitation did make the movement more simple and probably fit the whole pop-up book aesthetic more closely, it did present some unique frustrations. First off, it wasn't always clear where the enemy projectiles were going to hit. There were many times where an enemy would shoot an arrow or magic bolt at me, and even though it would visually pass through my character, it wouldn't do any damage. I'm guessing it mostly has to do with how the collision coding was written, but it led to some moments which didn't really make sense. Also, even though the simplicity of movement was nice at times, I didn't like being locked into a specific track. I could change directions, but there was much less strategy in movement than there could have been. So, movement was a bit of a bummer, but how was combat? Fighting felt old school in such a familiar and fun way. In order to understand combat better though, let's first discuss progression. You have 3 main forms of progression apart from your own skill development. First, as you level up and find a loot, you can upgrade your health and mana pools. Despite health and mana being pretty much the most basic forms of progression, the pacing of those upgrades was quick and felt really nice. The second form of progression took the form of cards, which are essentially just abilities. Cards are broken up into 3 classes. First, there are item cards. When you equip an item card on your character, such as a health or mana potion, they're usable so long as you have charges remaining. Mana has no effect on these cards, and the only 2 ways you can get more charges is through loot found in the dungeons and through the fortune teller in town. The second class of cards are the spells, which are essentially your active abilities. You can get a dash that stuns enemies, a fireball to set enemies ablaze, an area of attack blade spin, and so on. When you have one of these equipped, their use is limited only by mana and cooldown. Most of the cooldowns are pretty quick, although every time you use an ability, it does use up some of your mana. The last class of cards are the artifacts, which are passive abilities. You're able to get artifacts that double your attack, or one that gives you the chance to block stuns, or another that slowly regenerates your health. The effects are permanently active when you have them equipped, but the unique thing is that instead of using blue mana, they convert a portion of your mana tank to green, unusable mana. For example, if I had a mana tank of 10 and wanted to equip an artifact with a cost of 3, it would effectively reduce my mana pool for spells to 7. That's because the artifact locks up 3 of the 10 as green mana and only 7 remain as usable blue mana. This creates a fun trade-off where you can equip a lot of artifacts, but it really limits your mana pool for spells. On the other hand, if you equip a lot of spells, you're much more limited by cooldowns and whether you have blue mana left. There's definitely a balancing act when it comes to crafting your loadout. Despite there being only 3 main classes of cards, there are a ton of unique cards within each type, and most of those cards can be upgraded to add additional effects. That's where the third form of progression comes into play. When you head into town after a dungeon raid, you can not only gossip with the townspeople and learn more about the enemies you've encountered, but you can also upgrade cards and unlock more slots. These 3 forms of progression all contribute toward making combat an experience that evolves and improves throughout the game. At its core, the combat system is nothing more than hacking and slashing your way through dozens and dozens of skeletons, zombies, living gargoyles, and dark wizards to pick up loot and work your way toward hell, but the ability system, as well as the introduction of a lot of enemy types, help to keep combat enjoyable and fast-paced. Since I want to be careful that we don't get lost in the minutia of fighting, let's look at 2 positives and 2 negatives of combat. The first positive is that using your abilities is fun. Even a lot of the artifact abilities are interesting. You're dashing, freezing enemies, knocking them back, and hitting them with acid. What's great is that your loadout is entirely up to you and how you want to play. You can be a tank and use a bunch of defensive abilities, you can be a glass cannon and try to wipe out your foes before you're overwhelmed, or, if you can't decide, you can ride the line in between. There are lots of fun elemental augments, and your choice of abilities really does affect the way you play. Second, the enemy variety adds a healthy amount of complexity to the game. Most of the enemies require that you react different ways in order to properly fight them. Some enemies charge at you and stun you if you don't get out of the way, other enemies will explode with fire damage when they die, another set of foes have shields which you have to click on to break. The loadout freedom and enemy variety both helped to keep me on my toes during gameplay. First off, on the negative side, the level design became pretty stale after a while. I do understand that the whole point of this genre is to provide a satisfying combat and progression loop, but I wanted to see even more creativity and diversity in the actual levels. One boss level in particular stands out to me because at the beginning, the boss scatters all your cards throughout the map. You then have to work your way back through, hoping to pick up the spells that you actually want. I enjoyed that level because it added some flair to the formula. Once I collected all of my cards, I could just re-equip my previous loadout and play normally, but for a period, I had to make do with whatever I found, and that twist was fun. Apart from that level, there really wasn't much variance in level design, which really could have added a lot to the game. My second complaint piggybacks on the first. You as the player are never truly encouraged to switch up your loadout, which led to some sameness in encounters. To be fair, I could have changed my loadout every single time I entered a dungeon, but I had no reason to change my loadout since it felt overpowered and worked just fine. Certain enemies were susceptible to different types of spells and artifacts, but at a certain point, I found that I could build a loadout which pretty much covered all the bases. Overall, combat was super enjoyable. Diablo and other similar games from that era proved that this genre can be super addicting, and Book of Demons doesn't stray far from that formula. It's not perfect, but it's sure as hell satisfying. Last but not least, let's discuss the art and sound design. On the art side, Book of Demons has a very unique look. The color palette felt very old school and familiar, while the characters and environment had the twist of a pop-up book aesthetic. This game is weird because even though the art wasn't that great in my opinion, it still had a charm to it that's hard to fully explain. I think a lot of it comes back to the feeling of it being old school. It plays to those notes of nostalgia, which caused me to look past some of my dislikes. On the sound design side, the score really didn't stand out either way for me. It wasn't great and it wasn't terrible. It fit the game, and that's about all I have to say about it. What did stand out to me though were the voice actors. I think many of the voices were probably overacted, but it totally fit the vibe. There were so many pieces of this game that took me back to a different era of PC gaming, and I loved it. Yes, some of the voices and dialogue were cheesy, but I think they added to the game's charm more than they detracted from the quality. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design, let's look at the positives and negatives of the game as a whole. First off, on the positive side, Book of Demons is charming. Every aspect of this game has a sense of nostalgia that is super captivating to the experience. Second, Book of Demons is like a build-your-own Diablo 1 game. You choose the length and loadout, and then you can hack and slash to your heart's content. On the negative side, I have one main complaint. Although nostalgia is a powerful and often wonderful feeling, it doesn't mask the flaws that are inherent to the game. Old school is interesting to experience, but there's also a reason why game design has iterated and evolved the way it has. Book of Demons lacks much diversity in level design, and the developer's choice to limit movement to lanes felt archaic. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to farm up and wait for a sale. I really did have a great time with this game. It wasn't amazing, but it was absorbing, and I love the concept of return to games. You can easily tell that the devs at ThingTrunk are huge gamers themselves, and it felt good to support this game. That being said, the price of nearly $25 is, in my opinion, too steep for a game that doesn't really present a unique value proposition. If I were you, I would pick this up in a sale and have a fun weekend of basking in the rays of nostalgia while slaying hordes upon hordes of demons. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. Don't forget to take a moment to email me your thoughts on the show, and if you enjoyed the episode, let a friend know about it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the dungeons.